I'm sorry, I've gone a little bit mad. I spent today, like, I did my taxes, I sent some emails, and then I sorted out 2 boxes of crap and condensed them into 1 box of crap, which I didn't have time to actually sort the crap from the crap. But yeah, it's been a day. And Josh is now looking at me like a crazy woman. I know I'm a crazy woman, Josh. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Depending on when I can get this edited for, it is either Christmas Eve or Boxing Day, or that weird time in between Christmas and New Year. So whenever you're seeing this, happy Christmas. I hope you're having / are going to have / have had a lovely and safe festive season with your family. I hope you got to chill. I hope you got to have some fun in a safe way, and that you're loving life. And to celebrate this pagan festival co-opted by a Christian festival, co-opted by a consumerist hellscape of capitalist dystopia, I thought we would celebrate that age-old British Christmas tradition, which is the British Christmas Pantomime. Woo! If you're not from the UK, you've probably never heard of pantomime, but pantomimes, or pantos as they're called, are a huge British tradition at Christmas. For a lot of people, it's their first experience going to the theatre. For many people, it's also the only time that they go to the theatre is at Christmas, which can usually be their local Christmas pantomime. And for many performers as well, sometimes their first professional experience of performing is in panto as part of the young ensemble. Also, a lot of British theatres, as in the buildings, make the majority of their income, if not all of their income, at Christmas through the Christmas shows and Christmas pantomimes. And it can be the money earned at this time of year that actually pays for the rest of their financial year. So panto is really, really important. Panto isn't just in the UK. Some of Britain's ex-colonies have pantos on occasion. But if you're not from a traditionally English-speaking country, or a country that was once colonized by the British, we got around, then you probably, when you hear the word pantomime, think miming, like no talking, miming walking downstairs or pulling on a rope or getting blown away by the wind in like stripy shirts and berets and stuff, which is not what it is. So I thought it would be fun for the non-Brits who watch my channel to learn a bit about this very specific type of theatre that we have here in the UK. And for my British viewers, I thought you might be interested to hear a bit about the history of pantomime and how this type of theatre that many people either love or hate came to be. So if you're interested in that, keep on watching. There is no show of the week because, as you will learn, pantomimes aren't like set shows, so I can't really be like, watch this panto or listen to this panto. So instead, I'll just put some like nice Christmas songs in the description for you to listen to, or just songs that I like. I'll just put some songs in the description. Check them out if you like. Before we get into the history of panto, I just want to go through the stock characters for those of you who aren't familiar with panto, just because, as you will see, they start to emerge throughout the history of panto as it evolves in the UK. And whatever panto you're doing, whatever story you're making into a pantomime, these stock characters really are going to be there, unless it's some kind of really, really modern panto where they're like trying to change up the form and modernize it. So it's good to know what you're looking out for. The 5/6 stock panto characters are: number 1, the principal boy, who is like your male lead, which is traditionally played by a woman in men's clothing. So it's also sometimes called a breeches character or a breeches role. The second stock character is the panto dame, traditionally played by a man in drag. And I don't think there is any panto anywhere who would like not have a panto dame as a man in drag. I've not really heard of anyone kind of breaking that tradition at all yet. Number 3 is the principal girl, also for modern panto sometimes called the princess character, because most modern pantos are based on fairy stories with princesses, but she tends to be the ingenue and she tends to be the love interest of the principal boy. Number 4/5 is the comic lead and or the good fairy. Now sometimes your good fairy can also be your comic lead. You can have a comic good fairy with all of the gags, or sometimes you'll have a separate comic character. For example, I think it's in Cinderella, the comic character tends to be Buttons, and you will also have a good fairy. So in Cinderella, it would be the fairy godmother, obviously, as the fairy, and then you've got Buttons on the side being funny. So depending on the panto and how it's written, they can either be in the same character, one and the same character, or they can be separate. And finally, you have the panto villain. You can't have a panto without a villain because we need someone to boo and hiss at, guys. So those are your 5/6 panto stock characters. We will see how they evolve throughout this video. Ooh. I don't know why I did that. It's me trying to be in the ghost scene, like, ooh. It's behind you. It's not behind me. My water bottle's behind me. That's about it. I do have notes for this bit, by the way. So if I look down, it's because panto has a long history and I only learned about it the other day. So if I look down, I'm looking at notes. But enough of that. Let's get on to some facts. The history of panto. Where did it all start? Where did it begin? Who knows? I know, and I'm gonna tell you. Let's start with where the word pantomime comes from. And who do we have to thank? The Romans. That's right, they gave us roads, aqueducts, sanitation, and pantomime. The word pantomime comes from the Roman word pantomimus, which itself comes from the Greek word pantomimos. Panto, meaning all in Greek, and mimos, meaning a dancer who performs or acts all of the characters or all of the story. And that's what Roman pantos were. It was a dancer on their own, accompanied by a libretto, so a musician kind of adding music, because you can't, well, I guess you can dance to silence, but I think it was probably better with the music. And they would, on their own, act out Greek and Roman myths and Greek and Roman stories. And these Roman pantomimes were performed throughout the Roman Empire, and they really helped in disseminating Greek and Roman myths and legends throughout the Roman Empire. It's how we heard about them on our tiny little islands that the Romans really didn't want to go to until they were, you know, forced to, because, was it Claudius? I think it was Claudius was like, hey, we want to go to Britain. And it's like, why? It's cold and it rains all the time. Why do you want to come here? But hey, they did. I would have stayed in Italy. Weather's far better. They just love that conquest. Whereas I'm like, hey, just give me a beach, some like lovely olive oil, some fish. Can you tell I have not been on holiday for freaking forever? I just want to leave this island. I want to leave Plague Island. And that's as far as the Roman pantomime went in influencing British pantomime. They basically just gave us the name. But interesting yet slightly tangential fact is that the Roman pantomimes went on to influence what became court dance in Europe, which then evolved into ballet. So you wouldn't have ballet without Roman pantomimes. Boom. No snobbery here, it's all connected. So if British pantomime didn't directly evolve from Roman pantomimus, where did it come from? To answer that question, we first have to go back to the Middle Ages in Britain and the Mummers Play. And the Mummers Play was a folk play that was traditionally performed around Christmas and New Year. And these plays were largely based on the stories of St. George and other kind of folk heroic tales and saints' tales. And in these Mummers Plays, even though panto hasn't been invented yet, we still have quite a lot of the elements already there. For starters, we've got the fact that it's a show that's done around Christmas time, but we also have staged fight, lewd humour. We also have gender role reversal. You've got men playing women, women playing men, and also you've got good versus evil and good overcoming evil. Again, a huge plot point of pantos. What comes in later is the influence of Commedia dell'Arte. Now, I'm not going to go into the history of Commedia dell'Arte because firstly, we didn't do Commedia dell'Arte when I trained, because I trained in musical theatre and there just wasn't time in a 9-month course. But also, that's like a whole other thing. We don't have time today. One of the big things that Commedia dell'Arte had is the use of stock characters. The stock characters in Commedia dell'Arte are the young lovers, old men, usually the main old man is called pantaloon, the servants, which usually include clown, and later in the 17th century you get the introduction of harlequin. Commedia dell'Arte and its stock characters are brought over to England, are introduced to England, and English and British theatre makers take these stock characters and Commedia dell'Arte and they develop it into what is then known as the English harlequinade. Now, whereas Commedia dell'Arte tended to have different plots with different main characters from within the stock characters, depending on what story you're telling, the English harlequinade basically focused on one plot with the stock characters just playing the same roles. And this plot was The young lovers, which were called Harlequin and Columbine, are eloping, or they try to elope, and they are pursued by Pantaloon, which is Columbine's father, and he is assisted by his servants, one of which will usually be Clown. And you have a lot of crazy chase scenes as they're trying to stop the lovers from eloping and getting married. Another important thing about the Harlequinade, which was different in Europe, is that the Harlequinades in England were silent up until 1843. Before 1843, only patent theatres in London were allowed to perform spoken drama with spoken dialogue. Everything else had to be sung or danced or whatever. Because of the Harlequinade being silent, obviously it was a very physical and visual form of theatre entertainment. And even after 1843, that kind of more visual aesthetic to the genre of the Harlequinade kind of persisted. And even to this day, if you see a panto, it is incredibly visual. If I can, I'll put up some pictures. If I can find some performance photos of some pantos, I'll insert them here. You can see it's very bright colours, very visual, very broad strokes, even to this day. As for the stories, unlike modern pantos, which we'll get to later, it's still kind of kept with the Greek and Roman myths and legends in terms of the stories. This is partly to do with how the Harlequinade fitted into pantomime. So the pantomime wasn't the Harlequinade itself, it was the inclusion of the Harlequinade into these Greek and Roman stories. So you'd have your serious opera or ballet telling the story of, let's say, Dido and Aeneas, and then in the middle, between acts 1 and 2, to break it up, you'd have this comic Harlequinade with all of the kind of miming, silent craziness and chase scenes and whatnot. The other thing that was taken from Commedia dell'Arte really early on was the use of the slapstick. Now, the slapstick in Commedia dell'Arte is a physical stick. I think it was called a batte. I don't speak Italian, so sorry if I pronounced that wrong, but it was a literal stick that you used for hitting people and stuff. So firstly, the physical stick, or versions of it, sometimes it would be a sword or whatever, were used in transformation scenes. For example, Harlequin, when you were changing from the kind of serious part of the production into the Harlequinade, or just changing scenes, would hit bits of the set and then that would make the set transform. But also in terms of the type of comedy known as slapstick, because Harlequinades were silent, slapstick played a huge role in how it was performed as well. And again, that is something that has carried over into modern panto, where you always have a slapstick comedy scene. In the 1800s, we start to see classical tales replaced with folk and fairy tales, which persist to this day. We also start to see the Harlequinade becoming longer until it's becoming kind of the most important part of the show. People are no longer coming to see the story of whatever the serious part of the pantomime is, and then, oh, the Harlequinade is just there for a bit of fun. Now people are coming to see the Harlequinade itself. This is when we start to see children going to see pantos as well, seeing pantos at Christmas, New Year, and also at Easter and other times of the year as well. Pantos weren't just relegated to the Christmas and New Year time at this point. But you see children going to see the wacky zany antics of the characters in the Harlequinade. In terms of the stock characters, we start to see additions and developments. So firstly, the clown character, which was in the original Commedia dell'Arte stock characters, starts to have more of a role, becomes a more important character within the Harlequinade. And we start to see the clown transition from assisting Pantaloon, girl's father, and being more of a servile comic role, to kind of becoming the lead antagonist. It tends to be Clown that is trying to scheme to break the lovers apart, rather than the father wanting to break the lovers apart. We also see the addition of a policeman character. I couldn't find information on why this is, like why we suddenly need a policeman. I don't know what like the cultural or social context of that is, but again, the policeman character tends to serve as trying unsuccessfully to help Pantaloon and Clown stop the lovers, but he tends to do a bad job, like pointing them in the wrong direction and things. We also see the plot of the Harlequinade develop, obviously because it's a longer and more important part of the story. You can't just have people running around with no objective. So we start to see the development of love triangle plots. So you'll have Columbine, the daughter of Pantaloon, and she's in love with Harlequin, who is poor, but he's worthy of his love and he loves her and he, you know, would do anything for her. And then you have a kind of rich, wealthy fop character who the father Pantaloon wants Columbine to marry. Obviously, the lovers want to be together, so they elope and then everyone tries to stop them. But we get the introduction of kind of more sophisticated, shall we say, plot lines within the Harlequinade because it has to prop up more of the entertainment, so you need a better story. We also, as we're going to fairy and folk tales, see the introduction of the fairy queen or the fairy godmother, which of course is going to develop into the good fairy. We love that. It seems that at the beginning the good fairy was more of a plot device, so she would facilitate the transformation of the characters from their fairy tale characters into their Harlequinade characters. So this is a bit confusing, but let's say obviously you've got your Harlequinade characters who are Harlequin and Columbine, but for the sake of argument, you're doing the story of, let's say, Sleeping Beauty. So your Sleeping Beauty would turn into Columbine and your prince would turn into Harlequin and Sleeping Beauty's dad would turn into Pantaloon. Do you see what I mean? So it's kind of to facilitate that transition for the audience. So they're like, oh, we're going into the Harlequinade section now, if that makes sense. So that was kind of the fairy godmother's role within these pantos in the 1800s, and she'd usually have a speech where she'd talk through and she'd basically be like, and now you will play this character and you will don the clothes of this character, and you know, and really spell it out. With these more developed and sophisticated plots, we also see specific scenes being included that again still persist today. Obviously from the year dot of the English Harlequinade we had the chase scene because the whole point was that it was a chase, but we also have the introduction of the dark scene, which usually would take place in a forest and a cave. I mean, I don't have any scholarly evidence for this, but to me, just reading that, it sounds a lot like the ghost scene that we tend to have in modern pantos, which we'll get into a bit later. I don't get into it later because I forgot, but basically the ghost scene is where the dame is just chilling out in a scary place and a ghost comes and scares her. There's a bit more to it than that, but that's basically it. But yeah, again, as the Harlequinade is becoming more important, we're seeing more of these kind of seeds of what are going to become stock moments in the traditional British panto. From the rule change in 1843, which said that any theatre could perform spoken dialogue, the importance of the Harlequinade starts to decrease. What we do see, because people are allowed to talk, from the very earliest spoken pantos, we see the importance of puns and wordplay. This is still a huge part of panto to this day. It's not just about the slapstick and the crazy physical comedy. There is a lot of emphasis in well-written pantos on puns and wordplay, and also double entendre. And that gets cemented in as soon as you are allowed to perform spoken dialogue, which makes sense. You're suddenly allowed to use words. Of course, pantomime writers are going to want to take advantage of that. However, the Harlequinade in its kind of original form as a silent comic interlude within the main plot starts to rapidly decline. It goes from being kind of in the middle of the show to being a brief epilogue at the end where they showcase some dancing and acrobatics, to finally being performed for the last time in 1939. However, all of the elements of the Harlequinade that people loved, the chase scenes, the physical comedy, all of the craziness, that all kind of gets enveloped into the panto proper, as in the main plot of the show. You don't need to do that in the Harlequinade anymore. You can just make a show that has all of that plus talking. And you don't need to transform into the Commedia dell'Arte characters. You can just have the main characters doing all of that zany stuff. And thus, the modern panto. Let's talk about that. With modern pantos today, as I mentioned before, we tend to draw on fairy tales and folk tales. Some pantos that are quite common include, but are not limited to, Cinderella, Aladdin, Dick Whittington and his cat, Snow White, Jack and the Beanstalk, Peter Pan, Sleeping Beauty, Puss in Boots,
Robinson Crusoe.
Robinson Crusoe, that was the one I was in. They all tend to be fairy tales from the likes of the Brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen or that French guy who wrote Beauty and the Beast, and I can't remember his name. So aside from the stock characters, what other features are there of modern British pantomime? Firstly, they tend to be rewritten every year. There are some caveats, which we'll get into later, but at least some of the panto is going to be rewritten because it will include modern pop songs. You always have to have whatever the hit song of the year is, like you have to. And then those songs tend to have rewritten lyrics depending on the plot. It won't always be modern songs, you'll need a mix. But yeah, you need to add new songs. You also need to add new dances. In my year, when flossing was the thing, we had to floss. And I think in the walk down, the ensemble did another dance that was big on Fortnite that year. When Gangnam Style was in, every panto had a bit where they did Gangnam Style. So anything that's like modern songs, modern dances, modern trends that the kids are down with, they're gonna want to incorporate those. And also kind of topical, political or social commentary. If I can find it, I'll link it in the description. This year, there was an article in The Guardian about the number of pantos that have like Boris Johnson references. So Greenwich Panto, which is the panto that I did a few years ago, they have a joke about Christmas parties because there's this whole scandal about last year when the whole country was in lockdown. Boris Johnson and his cronies had a Christmas party where they had cheese and wine and stuff. So there's a joke about that in the Greenwich Panto. I think it's at the Panto at the Lyric Hammersmith. They've got a character who, even though that character is played by a woman, the design of the character is absolutely Boris Johnson. There'll always be kind of topical jokes and gags, either in the design, like visual gags, or the verbal humour. People will add stuff in. Also, a lot of panto, particularly when it comes to the pantomime dame, is really improvisatory. It can easily be that thing of if something happens during the panto's run, the panto dame, if they're good at doing stuff like that at short notice, which most panto dames are, is kind of part of the gig, will throw something in there. All this to say that you don't have like a set script that you always stick to. Even pantos that, you know, they tend to be recycled year after year, there will be a rewrite to include topical things. Another big thing with modern panto is that it is humour for all ages. In fact, the show is for all ages. A lot of pantos will bill themselves as being like from 3 to 93. It's not uncommon for people to bring babes in arms to the theatre. You have like kids running around at the front of the stage, sometimes trying to climb on the stage, and it's like, okay, we know it's for families, but please, like, they can't come on the stage. It's literally the whole family. You can get 3 or 4 generations of one family going to see the Christmas Panto. And they all need to be entertained and they all need to find it funny. So oftentimes you'll have double entendre for the adults. Double entendre is like a huge part of panto, and depending on the demographic will depend how much they push the envelope. If it's an adult panto, like built for adults, obviously it will be like, I want to say balls to the wall. I don't know if that's all right to say, but it would be like balls to the wall, like sexual innuendo, absolutely. If it's a panto like Chipping Norton, I know just from, you know, hearing from people who work in panto quite a lot, that tends to be a more subdued panto. They aim more at the family and kid side of things, so their jokes would not be as risque. So it does depend on your demographic, like who you're aiming for, but there's always going to be some kind of innuendo there, as well as double entendre for the adults and also for the teenagers who think that like they're way too old for this stuff, but they can get like the adult jokes and be like, huh, I get that, I'm an adult. You have scatological humour for the kids, and for the adults who think they're kids, and for the teenagers who think they're grown but they're not actually grown and they still find fart jokes funny. You're gonna have some of that. Again, from its origins of being basically dumb show, you have a lot of visual comedy, a lot of slapstick, like I said. Also, wordplay. There's, I don't know if it's in every panto, but definitely in our panto, there was like a whole scene of fish puns. It was glorious. I think most pantos will have a scene where it's just like all of the puns that are topical to the story of the show. So yeah, wordplay is a huge part of panto. And particularly with self-produced pantos where the theatre is self-producing their panto or it's produced in-house, writing pantos for the audience. There's quite a few pantos that do this. Greenwich does it every year. Stratford East write their own panto. I believe Hackney Empire do their own panto. Chipping Norton does their own panto. I believe Cheltenham does as well, because I know the guy who's writing it, so I'm assuming it's an in-house production. The good thing about writing your own panto, especially if you're used to doing it, is that you know your audience and you can really cater to them. You know what kind of humour they have. You know how far you can push the envelope with things like double entendre and innuendo. You can really tailor what you're doing to your audience. It gives you a lot of room to really play into that and, you know, bring in local topical things, you know? As well as the humour, panto is all about the audience participation. And for non-Brits who don't know panto, this might sound like the cringiest thing on earth, and there are probably some British people who, like, they don't like panto because they find it the cringiest thing on earth. It's better when everyone's in on it and doing it. Like, it's just like everyone rolls with the vibe. So two of the classic ones that, like, if it's your first time at a panto, you pick up on it quickly, don't worry, but like you might be like, what is everyone doing? Is the he's behind you. So you'll have a character, let's say you're doing Jack and the Beanstalk. Jax comes forward and been like, oh, I've been running through this forest and I haven't seen not Snow White. What's the cow's name? Milky White. Oh, I haven't seen Milky White in this forest anywhere. I've lost her. Where is she? And then the pantomime cow walks along upstage behind him and the whole audience goes, she's behind you. And then Jack's like, what? Where? What do you mean? She's behind me. By the time Jack turns around, the cow's gone and he's like, oh, you lied to me. You said she was there and she's not. And then the cow comes back and they're like, it's behind you. No. It's mostly for the younger kids, I think. The kids just like laugh it up, being like, oh my god, the cow is there. So that's kind of a standard one. The other one, which I can't think of an example of when this is used, but the oh no it isn't, oh yes it is gag routine. I think it might be the panto dame usually is saying something and then the audience respond and then the dame's like, oh no it isn't, and then the audience is like, oh yes it is, oh no it isn't, oh yes it is. I can't remember the setup for that one as well. I've alluded to this one as well, but another tradition is the pantomime horse or cow. So you'll have two guys in a suit, one's the back end, one's the front end, back end. If you're seeing like a traditional panto, there'll be some kind of pantomime horse, cow, camel, some kind of four-legged thing.
Herbivore.
Yeah, four-legged herbivore with multiple stomachs.
Do you think we'll have a Diplodocus one yet?
I'd love to see a pantomime Diplodocus. That'd be great. Another tradition which I didn't know about till researching this video is that the good fairy always enters from stage right, auditorium left for the audience, and the villain always enters from stage left, auditorium right for the audience. And this dates back to medieval mystery plays where stage right represented heaven and stage left represented hell, which I didn't know, and I find that really interesting. So yay. A couple more traditions that I want to mention are to do with casting. So firstly, especially for bigger pantomimes, you can sometimes have the ensemble made up of local children. So you have local children in the chorus. Like I said in the beginning, for some performers, that is literally their first experience of performing outside of a school setting, for example. And it can be a really pivotal moment for young people, whether they go into the profession or, you know, it's just this amazing thing they used to do every Christmas, which is really lovely. And lastly on casting, there is a massive tradition of celebrity casting. For example, the London Palladium panto at the moment is nothing but celebrities, but usually up and down the country, unless it's like a really local panto, for example, Greenwich Panto doesn't do celebrity casting, but in your bigger pantos that are going into bigger venues or pantos that are done by larger panto producing companies such as Kudos, you will tend to have some celebrity casting. They'll get someone from X Factor in to play the villain or whatever. And I thought this was a pretty modern kind of thing to do. But celebrity casting in pantomime, at least, actually goes back to the late 19th century. So yeah, I think that's long enough to consider it tradition, like a couple of 100 years. So those are the conventions of modern panto today. But like any form of theatre that has been around in its modern form since the 1940s and has a lot to do with tradition, it potentially, arguably, has some problems, especially in our modern day with our modern sensibilities. So I do want to talk a bit about that, because panto is a great tradition, and for it to be able to continue, I think it does need to be reinvented, just like it got reinvented with the reduction of the harlequinade once people were allowed to talk. In our modern day, there are some things that probably could do with some revamping. So here are some potential problems with panto, which the industry and the panto sector specifically, in some areas, are trying to rectify and come up with solutions for, but are still there often. The first issue that has been brought up a lot when it comes to panto is insensitive or racist depictions of characters that are not white. And this particularly happens with Aladdin, a lot with Aladdin. So for context, and also this isn't something that I specifically mentioned in the video, for stories that have been adapted by people such as Disney, like Aladdin, Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, Snow White, the stories in panto are different to the Disney stories because obviously Disney owns the rights to their versions of the stories. So in the context of Aladdin, Aladdin is usually set in China. So because the panto Aladdin is usually set in China, and also I'm pretty sure the panto Aladdin predates the Disney Aladdin, there are some stock characters specific to Aladdin that at the time they were written, everyone was probably like, ha ha ha, just like funny Chinese people. And now is like, oh my God, all of the racism and yellowface. The two characters that I hear a lot being accused of this are two characters who I believe are policemen. Full disclosure, I've never actually seen the panto Aladdin, but I believe they're policemen, called Ping and Pong. In traditional versions of the pantos, often they're speaking in kind of broken English, like how stereotypically, racistly, you would expect Chinese people with English not as a first language to speak. Obviously, that's really problematic. Oftentimes, these characters would not be performed by people of East Asian or Southeast Asian heritage. They'd be performed by white people. So you have a huge problem with the Aladdin pantomime traditionally of yellowface. And because some of these pantomimes are going out into the provinces where I'm guessing you don't have a lot of that representation in the community, or at the very least it is assumed by the makers and producers of the pantos that, you know, we're going to Devon, there aren't going to be many Chinese people seeing this panto, so it's fine to not update this depiction or try and cast East Asian actors. It just perpetuates itself. It's bad that the depiction is racist and ignorant in the first place, and then also on top of that you're getting yellowface, and then on top of that oftentimes you're not even getting representation from that ethnic background, even in your cast, even in the ensemble. So all of these problems have been noted time and again by East Asian actors, particularly about the characters of Ping and Pong. There's also an issue of whitewashing of panto in general, particularly when it comes to the principal girl, the ingenue. Like back when I was younger, it would always be a young, pretty, white, blonde girl playing the princess. Nowadays, I am seeing more ethnic representation. We're now seeing more princesses that aren't white and blonde and blue-eyed. However, I would like to note that when the princess isn't white, she still tends to be light-skinned, which obviously being mixed race, I personally, like, that doesn't hurt me, but I think it does still show that colorism is an issue when it comes to our depiction of like young, pretty girl going off on her adventure with her principal boy kind of thing. Like, we can have a princess character with dark skin. We can have a princess character who is darker and she's still beautiful and lovely and young and ingenue and like, oh, everything's amazing, you know, because that's usually what the ingenue character is like. She tends to be very naive and new to the world and finds everything lovely. You can find things lovely and have dark skin, just saying. So I think that's also an issue. It is getting better as people with darker skin are being cast, but I can still see the bias there, and it's not okay. Another thing which I haven't seen as a criticism of Panto, but I'm just really interested, is that in society, as we become more aware of gender fluidity, how the idea of cross-dressing characters is going to evolve and grow with that. When you're doing gender reversal, whether it's a breeches character or a panto dame, it relies on the binary. And so with gender fluidity becoming not more common, as in people have always been non-binary, they just didn't have the terminology or the freedom to express themselves in that way, but there being more of a social awareness of it, I'm wondering how that would work. I do know that, not Robin Hood, Little Red Riding Hood at Stratford East, they have a character in their panto who is non-binary, because I read the script because I was seen for it. So that's interesting. I do think when you're producing your own panto and you're writing it in-house, it gives you the freedom to think about the form in new ways, because you can be like, okay, we've got to cater it to our audience and we know who our audience is. We know how we can approach these things, but these are the things that we want to try and explore here, or these are the things that we don't think are great about this particular panto. How do we make them so they're not problematic? How do we modernize the form to keep it going, which I think is great. On that note, I do want to talk about the commercialization and sterilization of panto, especially when it comes to the big panto companies. Now, if you're not sure how these big panto companies work, essentially it's like you have this big company and they have all of these pantos. They probably have every single panto that's ever been done. And what they'll do is they'll book out the larger, usually like the larger touring theatres, I believe, or like you can get big kind of opera house theatres or whatever, like 2,000 seaters in the regions. They'll book them out and they'll just plonk in one of their pantos. Snow White that you did in Devon one year could be going to Aberdeen the next year, kind of thing. They can go anywhere in the country. And yes, England, Britain, the UK, is relatively small, but if you think about it like a US state, what's going to work in one town in a US state is not going to work the same in another town on the other side of that same state, you know? Countries aren't homogenous like that. So in order for them to be able to work wherever they're going to stick them, the comedy, the humour, everything kind of needs to be toned down and homogenized to have the broadest possible appeal. Which I think is a shame. I think it's a shame because you end up with blander shows. And if you're just trying to appeal to everyone and you don't want to be offensive and you don't want to be too out there, I'm not saying you have to offend to be funny by any means, but when your first thought is broad appeal, no offense, no one having a problem, you're not gonna have a fun time as an audience member because you're not gonna find anything funny. Do you want to come say that? Josh has a point to add to my point.
Hello there friends, it's Josh here. So just to add to Michaela's point just there, where she's saying what you don't want your show to be, at that point you're more focused on what the show can't be, won't be, or in your eyes shouldn't be, rather than spending any time on what the show could be or might be, which means that you're taking things out of your theatre performance before you're putting anything into it, which is actually very bad for the show creatively, but it also leaves you as a creative far less room to manoeuvre and far less space to actually build.
Thank you, Josh.
Like and subscribe.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. As soon as you're coming from a place of mass appeal, you're not thinking about what you're actually making. Obviously, people like and dislike things for a lot of reasons. Panto is very polarizing. It's a very specific type of theatre, but kind of similar to what I said in my Why You Hate Musicals video. I do sometimes wonder if sometimes people have such a strong aversion to things like panto because all they've seen is bad ones, and panto is one of those genres where you have to commit to the bit, otherwise it's just naff. There's nothing worse than a panto that's not funny. because it's just cringe. I think we should go back to self-producing theatres. But of course we're in the middle of COVID and people are struggling, so I don't know. I don't know how the economics of the big panto companies works. I don't know if it works out cheaper. I guess for like a 2,000 seater theatre it would be cheaper to be like, hey, we've got all this money because we're a massive panto company, so we can hire your theatre. Whereas trying to fill that by yourself is I can't even imagine sitting in a 2,000 seat theatre. Like, you go into the Lyceum or the Apollo in London and they're like, I think they're like 1,500 about-ish, maybe a little bit less, and they're big theatres without celebrities. And then I guess that's the thing. If the only way you can sell out your 2,000 seat theatre for a whole run of a panto is by hiring a celebrity, that celebrity's only going to do it if financially it's worth their while. So that means you're paying the celebrity a lot, and if you don't have that capital in the first place, yeah, that's probably why, thinking about it. So I think economically it's kind of a double-edged sword. You have to go to the big panto companies because they have the money to hire the celebrities that are going to fill out your theatre, but the trade-off is you can't have a panto that is actually tailored to your audience, and you have a panto that has wider appeal. So yeah, I don't have a solution to that one. I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. I'm just a person. No. Editing me, I am so sorry for what I'm about to put you through. So that was the history of British Christmas pantomime. I hope you enjoyed this video. Have you guys ever seen a panto? If you're in the UK or elsewhere, like, have you ever seen a panto before? Did you think it was like miming? Or did you know what it was? I'd be interested to hear. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Would love to have you, yes you, on the channel. Come on down. We have a great time when we have time to edit. Stay tuned for more theatre content from a UK perspective, and I will see you all in my next video. Happy Christmas and bye friends!